Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about the original Mary Sue. The term Mary Sue is used fairly often to describe fiction in which there is a character who is a sort of author self-insert, or vaguely somebody who has amazing abilities but doesn't have a background that justifies it. Sort of a character to whom everything is given and nothing is expected, in a sense. Now, there's also Marty Stew, so you have sort of the same concept, somewhat, just gendered names. But the first Mary Sue actually comes specifically from a satire of fan fiction. It was published in Menagerie, not quite magazine, it was a fanzine. Sort of things in the 1970s, they were often printed incredibly cheaply, sometimes even by photocopying or something like that. And they'd be distributed either free or with just a nominal charge to cover printing. Authors weren't paid for it. It was just entirely run by fans for fun. And the editor of Menagerie, Paula Smith, wrote a satire of a sort of fan fiction story she saw a lot of. And it was called A Trekkie's Tale. It's only like 5 or 8 paragraphs long, and they're not very long paragraphs. So I'm actually going to read it, and then we're going to talk about the original Mary Sue. And it's actually different than what Mary Sue has come to mean, and much more interesting, actually. So here's A Trekkie's Tale by Paula Smith. Gee golly gosh glorioski, thought Mary Sue as she stepped on the bridge of the Enterprise. Here I am, the youngest lieutenant in the fleet, only 15 and a half years old. Captain Kirk came up to her. Oh, Lieutenant, I love you madly. Will you come to bed with me? Captain, I'm not that kind of girl. You're right, and I respect you for it. Here, take over the ship for a minute while I go get some coffee for us. Mr. Spock came on the bridge. What are you doing in the command seat, Lieutenant? The captain told me to. Flawlessly logical. I admire your mind. Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, and Mr. Scott, I think I read that, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, and Mr. Scott, beamed down with Lieutenant Mary Sue to Rigel 37. They were attacked by green androids and thrown into prison. In a moment of weakness, Lieutenant Mary Sue revealed to Mr. Spock that she too was half Vulcan. Recovering quickly, she sprung the lock with her hairpin, and they all got away back to the ship. But back on board, Dr. McCoy and Lieutenant Mary Sue found out that the men who had beamed down were seriously stricken by the jumping cold Robbies, Mary Sue less so. While the 4 officers languished in sickbay, Lieutenant Mary Sue ran the ship, and ran it so well that she received the Nobel Peace Prize, the Vulcan Order of Gallantry, and the Tralfamadorian Order of Good Guyhood. However, the disease finally got to her, and she fell fatally ill. In the sickbay, as she breathed her last, she was surrounded by Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, and Mr. Scott, all weeping unashamedly at the loss of her beautiful youth and youthful beauty, intelligence, capability, and all-around niceness. Even to this day, her birthday is a national holiday on the Enterprise. So, as you can see, this is satire. It's funny. It's fairly well done satire. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about this, if you look at the sort of points that make this up, you have Lieutenant Mary Sue, who comes out of nowhere, is completely amazing, everyone loves her, and then she dies. And apparently that last part, I did a little bit of background reading, and I saw something that suggested this is actually something of a description of teenage girls coming to deal with teenage girlhood. And I think there's something actually very much to that, because if you look at it, especially that dying part, and that's what really sort of makes it, not that teenage girls generally die, but this general pattern of appearing out of nowhere, suddenly great, everyone loves you, and then you die. That is not, in general, a good story for a man. This is not the story of how a man is. Now, if you look at, if you take that, like the Star Wars, hero's journey. I can't remember, Campbell, I think it was, who came up with this. The universal story that's not actually universal. But anyway, But nonetheless, it's still a decent story. Like if you look at it in Star Wars, where you have the person who starts off from the humble beginnings, then he goes into a period of training, and then he gets an opportunity. He takes advantage of this opportunity through a period of training, comes to realize his potential, and then saves the day, and having saved the day, then retires back to being normal. You can kind of see some similar things in the Hobbits and Lord of the Rings, and it's a common enough sort of thing because it does reflect the general journey of a man. A man is born with potential, and then over a long time he's got to realize this potential through training and hard work, and and just developing the potential over literally the course of years. He also needs some sort of opportunity. Needs help on this. Mentor figures figure prominently in both real life success, as well as in fiction. And then eventually, having become very competent over the course of literally years, having become stronger. It's kind of an interesting thing. You can see this in the physical realm. Look at gymnasts. It's really quite curious. Female gymnasts tend to peak around, well, often, right about as they're hitting puberty. But they'll tend to peak in their early teens. When do male gymnasts peak? They peak in their mid-20s. It takes a long time to develop the full strength of an adult male. A male is done with puberty, typically 16 to 18 years old. Often 16 by 17. Male's done with puberty. He's hit his full height, done with puberty. But it takes another 4 or 5 years to hit his peak strength because it just takes a long time to become strong. And that physical metaphor is even more true of psychological things. Look at complex skills. When do people become at their absolute best for really complex skills? Whether you're talking about, something like shooting, or you're talking about, things like martial arts and so on. Like when do people really peak there? And there you're looking often. Men will tend to peak in their mid 30s or even into their 40s. It's very often for combat sports, you'll see them peaking in their mid 30s because that's sort of the height of their physical strength. But the older they get, the better they get at it. If you look at really more complex activities like things like soldiering, it was often the case that the veteran soldiers, the people who had been in, look at the Roman army. The veteran soldiers, who were the best soldiers, the most effective soldiers, had been in the army for 20-something years, and they joined in their late teens. You're talking about men who are around their 40s, and these are the best soldiers you can find because they have, that combination of craftiness and hardiness, pain endurance, experience of pain, experience of suffering. They're not afraid nearly so much anymore. They've got just so much time to be good at what they do. And so, and they're still very physically strong because a man who actually keeps working can be strong in his 40s and even his 50s, quite strong. And so you get that. Now, if you look at even more complex things like statesmanship, politics, leading businesses, things like this is where you start seeing men peaking in their 50s and their 60s. It takes a really long time to get that knowledgeable and to have that much experience and to build it all up. The story of a man is one of a long, gradual build-up culminating in some sort of achievement. The hero's journey, so-called, there's some sort of crisis for the man to solve, but he's still got that long journey and then solves the crisis and then goes back to just being himself again when that crisis has passed. That's sort of that prototypical man's journey. However, this is not what you see. A woman can do this sort of thing too, by the way. A woman can go on a that sort of prototypical male hero's journey. It is possible for a woman to do. There are lots of things where women get better too over time, especially anything relating to, say, politics. And there are lots of things, but there is also a separate thing that really pertains to women, and especially young women, that doesn't pertain to men. And so, while it is possible to for a woman to go on the male hero's journey, it's usually an atypical woman who does this. Most women don't, as a rule, want to go on anything like a hero's journey. This is partially related to social status for a woman doesn't come from that. Social status, women get social status for achievements, but not, in some ways, not the most relevant social status, because in many ways the most relevant social status to people who are going to have children is the social status that really raises your importance in finding a good co-ancestor to your descendants. And so in terms of that, and because having children is the most important thing that most of us do in our lives, for those who have children, it's probably the biggest contribution to anyone anywhere they will ever make is giving new people life. So it really is, despite, in modern times we have this curious thing where people look down on, breeding, it's just like an animal. But, in fact, for most people, the best thing you're ever going to do is giving someone life. So it really is very important. And psychologically, it is very important. And the things that relate to it, about things like social status that help you to find mates, is also very important, psychologically speaking. And so if you look at what is the social status that does affect all women, though, and this is, again, teenage women, because this is what we're looking at in Mary Sue, what do you find? Well, so you have a girl, and girls and boys aren't all that distinct from each other until they hit puberty. There are differences. There are definitely, you can observe differences in personality and so on, and other things. But physically speaking, they're not all that distinct from each other. Males and prepubescent males and females, they tend to be about the same strength. They tend to do the same in sports and so on. You'll see some concentrations based upon, statistical distributions of interests and so on. But physically, they're not all that different until they hit puberty. And that's when males and females really start to pull apart from each other in terms of, overall differences and so on. And so, so a girl is going along, and then suddenly she hits puberty. I mean, puberty is granted a process, but it's a relatively fast process. You're only talking like a year or two, in which she starts transforming from the relatively androgynous creature of a prepubescent human being into a woman. And what happens when a girl becomes a woman, when she becomes a physical adult capable of reproduction? Suddenly, everyone's interested in her. What a young woman, a nulliparous woman, a woman who's never had children before, who a young woman chooses as a mate is very interesting to everyone around her. It's just, observe any human society, and you will see everyone is really interested in what young women are doing. That's to say, people who have, females who have gone through puberty and now are in sort of, their full, reproductive phase. And so, young women are at their most fertile for females. They're, in a sense, bursting with potentiality. They're bursting with potential. And a young woman represents a sort of almost unlimited potential. That is to say, she could choose, in some sense, anyone. I mean, actual choices are limited. But in sort of the way that people tend to relate to them, the choices that they make sort of seem kind of limitless. They could choose almost anyone as their mate. What sort of children will they actually produce? No one really knows until they start actually producing them, and you can see what their children are actually like. And so there's a sort of potential there. And the thing is, it's right there. Kind of hits very quickly. Like, once a woman has finished puberty and is actually reproductive, she is. There are years and years of study and training in order to prove her ability to have children, or her worth of having children, for that matter. And so it's a very sudden thing, like Mary Sue. In the story, Mary Sue just sort of shows up as the youngest officer in Starfleet, and here she is at 15 and a half, and everyone loves her. She's wonderful, and everyone loves her. Well, this is a bit like a girl becoming a woman. Suddenly, everyone's really interested in her. Now, when I say love her, I don't mean like in the full sense of either erotically or in the sense of agape, but everyone's really interested. Everyone's really curious. They pay a lot of attention. They pay a lot more attention to young women than they do to young men. Now, you then have that last part, though. So she's great and everyone loves her, and taking her competence at doing things like getting them out of prison using a hairlock, as this ability that young women have to conceive life inside of them and nurture that life into an actual living person outside of them. It's a really amazing thing, by the way, speaking as a parent. what a mother does is a truly amazing thing. And if you don't think so, you just don't appreciate it enough. But you probably instinctually do appreciate it, at least on some level. And so you have that. And then what's that dying part? Well, here's the interesting thing. That potential can't last forever. Especially, I mean, it intrinsically can't last forever because potential that's never actualized isn't actually potential. Or at least it's meaningless potential. But in human terms, a woman can't remain in that potential indefinitely and still have it. As the years go on, a woman becomes less fertile. The total number of children a woman can have goes down because menopause happens at pretty much the same time no matter what. And so since having a child tends to take, especially when you're breastfeeding children, which inhibits the return to fertility for a while, properly spacing children out, go figure. Doing things the natural way, produces naturally good results. But anyway, so, you're looking at a minimum of about 18 months per child and often more. And so the longer you go before you start reproducing, the fewer children it is possible for you to have. And this is significant because, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most brilliant people ever to live at any time, was something like the 11th out of 13 children. So, I mean, it took his parents something like 11 tries in order to produce the most brilliant person ever. So, not every one of your children is going to be the most brilliant person in the world ever. I mean, but the number of children you have really, has a significance that way in terms of how extraordinary your children actually can be and so on. So the longer you wait, the fewer chances you even have. Plus, just fertility declines. It can take more and more effort and more tries to actually get a child from the reproductive act. And so when you put it all together, that potential goes down over time. If the potential is completely unused, it goes down over time no matter what, and eventually will go away completely when you hit, in the range of the 50s. And so if mid 50s is pretty typical. And so that potential is going away. Guaranteedly, it's going to completely disappear at some point, and it's on a downward trajectory simply because time is passing. On the flip side, so you can't remain in potentiality forever and still have it. But on the flip side, if that potentiality becomes actuality, it ceases to be potentiality. So if the woman selects a mate and then has children, her potential has tremendously decreased. This is because her actuality has tremendously increased. She actually has a mate. She actually has given a new person life, engaged in this really amazing thing whereby we take part in creation. But that potential has largely gone away. I mean, the woman will still have, several more children, up to, about like 14 or so is around what is, the maximum possible if a woman starts very young. So a woman who has had children with her husband still has some potential, but not nearly as much because so much of it has been converted to actuality. Moreover, who she's picked as her husband. That one's turned from potentiality to actuality. You also see what her children are actually like, and so that has turned from potentiality to actuality. Moreover, that actuality of having a child has so many responsibilities on it as a parent that much of your potential also goes away simply because it has turned into this actuality of caring for people that you have helped to make. And so that potentiality that defined that Mary Sue, who burst onto the scene full of potential, sort of out of nowhere, will go away one way or the other. It's either going to decline slowly, coming to nothing, or it's going to suddenly drop rather quickly because it's been converted into actuality. So, there's kind of the interesting thing in this life of a young woman which does not at all parallel the hero's journey, the classical journey of the man who's got to increase his actuality until for a man, increasing his actuality is also increasing his potential. He's trading potential to train for abilities, but his abilities also produce his potential as something like a father and as a hero. So a man has to trade potential for actuality just to have potential, the potential he really cares about. For a woman, the potential just sort of appears suddenly out of nowhere and then decreases either quickly or or rapidly. And so it's a very different sort of perspective, and it comes with a different sort of set of trade-offs. Men have to learn things like the ability to be frustrated for a very long time, the ability to be disappointed for a very long time, the ability to deal with lots and lots and lots of rejection. There are all sorts of these things that a man has to be able to deal with. And you can see this again in the physical metaphor, like train with weights. It's great for everybody. And one of the things it teaches you is that, that old phrase, no pain, no gain, is in fact extremely true. Lifting weights hurts. I mean, if you do it enough to actually build muscle. You have to be willing to suffer through the sacrifice in time. You have to be able to suffer through the pain involved in lifting heavy things in order to get strong. Lift progressively heavier things to get strong. That's the sort of journey that man has to go on. He has to, from the get-go, has to be willing to face this sort of suffering to be able to come into having potential at all. In a sense, to be anything, he's got to be able to face this. For a woman, by contrast, she's hit very quickly, in teenage years, with having enormous amounts of potential. And so she's got a very different problem to deal with. She doesn't need to earn her potential through struggle and difficulty. She's got to be responsible at a young age with an enormous amount of, responsibility. But she gets this large amount of potential, then has to direct it in some good way, and has to make that decision relatively early and doesn't get too many mistakes to do it with. And so it's a very different sort of psychological issue. And I think this also relates to why teenage girls seem so incredibly stressed. I mean, people refer to it as the angst and the drama. But I think people aren't sympathetic enough to teenage girls. It's not an easy position to be in. And I think adult women tend to forget what it's like because they've made a decision and moved on to the next phase of their life. And so they're not really, mentally there. It's just sort of a side note. But in general, in my experience, the people who sort of have the least almost respect for teenage girls or adult women tend to be very, very, very dismissive of their concern and their angst and drama. It's sort of an interesting thing, but the thing that the young woman has to then face is that she's got to choose essentially one of three possibilities. One, sort of a common one, is she's got to make an actual choice and then convert her potential into actuality. And then she's got to be happy with that actuality and in the dearth of potential, because, here's this potential and it's thrilling and it's happy and it's fun, not happy. But, people being interested in you is nice. I mean, it's got its downsides too, but it's nice. And, being important is nice in certain regards. I'm not saying uniformly, hence the, angst, but it's got to be given up, and it's got to be given up in a big lump sum, basically turned into actuality. And then the woman who has made this choice has to stay committed to it, having sort of irrevocably given up her lump sum of potentiality that she was given at puberty. She then has to follow this through and be happy with her life changing radically again from one of potentiality into actuality. That's one of them. One of them is essentially giving up the potentiality in a different way. This is the life of, the committed single life, or the life of a nun, who has to then make the decision to essentially, in some sense, in a limited sense, turn her back on this potentiality and pursue something else as more important anyway, and then stick to that. So she still has to turn away from it. And then the third way is simply having a choice made for you by never making a choice, and so trying to live in it and then, essentially diminishing over time as the potentiality goes away, trying to cling to it, and it can't be clung to, and then, essentially, 30 years later, your life has been just sort of frittered away, trying to remain in an impossible situation. And then there's, laser surgeries and Botox and all sorts of other things to try to reclaim this, but it can't be reclaimed. And so, and that, down that path lies real misery. The other two paths, the first two that I described, are, however, ones in which it takes a lot of work to be content with what you have. This is true for both men and women. Whenever you turn potentiality into actuality, you then have the not very easy in this fallen world task of enjoying the good which you now have and not comparing it to potential goods you no longer can have, but being happy with what is. Not an easy task, required male and female for happiness. In some ways, I think it may be a little bit harder for women because it's such its transitions tend to be so sudden. Not as much for nuns for down that path, because that transition, the transition into being a biologically adult female is pretty rapid, but then the choosing something else is not quite as irrevocable in the moment. And I mean, you have to take temporary vows before you can take permanent vows in monastic orders, and so you can sort of settle into that one. May be one of the reasons why nuns have a reputation for being very happy. There are other reasons too. I'm not chalking it all up to that. So you see in these, the three possible ways that things go, except for the way of trying to cling to your youth, which is a losing proposition. The other two basically are Mary Sue dying. That, creature of potential that popped into existence, it can't last. And so it's got to be killed off in one fashion or another. She has this enormous potential, but has to commit it to something. And in the committing of that potential to some actual plan, it ceases to be potential, and Mary Sue dies. So, the actual original Mary Sue story, I think, it's a terrible story if it's told about a man. Marty Stew is an awful character. Guaranteed. Mary Sue is interesting in that it is the story of a teenage girl, and I think there's an element in which, by and large, people just don't have enough sympathy with teenage girls. I'm grateful to God that I was given, the life that I was given, and don't have to deal with anybody else's troubles. So that's sort of generally true. But I do not envy teenage girls the things they have to deal with. And in some sense, I think there is actually a lot to learn from the original story of Mary Sue, in that it actually does reveal something about a particular portion of humanity, a particular portion of their life, and the struggles they actually have to deal with. The more modern Mary Sues, like when you just have the Rey character in Star Wars, where she's just completely awesome for no reason, and still just completely awesome for no reason, and it'll keep being completely awesome for no reason. Doesn't really do much of anything, doesn't have much in the way of character, doesn't have much in the way of struggles, and then just whines a lot. Whines and complains a lot. That's not a good character. That's also not the original Mary Sue. This is more just, frankly, bad character writing. It's not actually the original Mary Sue, and so I think there's something very interesting here. It's not a universal story. Most of the best stories in life are ones that apply to everybody, and ones that within the character interactions you can see all sorts of universal human truths that we all can learn something from. Whereas Mary Sue is kind of dealing with a specific set of problems, but it's a specific set of problems that most of us, I think, don't ever really think about, and could possibly be a little more sympathetic to. So it's an interesting story in that regard, I think. The original Mary Sue, not just overpowered characters where the writers don't want to actually give them any struggles or ever have them improve or anything really. So anyhow, I hope that was interesting. It's a curious story. It's a curious little part of history, and it's also interesting how the name shifted in its meaning, I think, because the original meaning is a very narrowly scoped one, and you see a lot more bad writing than you see this sort of exploration. So, hope that was interesting, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.